many of you know that just how much I love to study history. Um, and it's amazing. I can remember all kinds of worthless tidbits about ancient wars and rulers. And I really enjoy looking back at how things were. And I'm embarrassed to say that I really enjoy second guessing the experts. And lately, I've been on a World War II kick, where I've been watching a lot about the what was going on in the war, specifically the naval war in the Pacific, which for an Army guy seems like that might be a little bit strange. But yeah, I as much as I love looking at history and looking back at how things happened, I can't even begin to imagine what it would be like to look forward as clearly as we look backwards. And I mean, that's unheard of for humans. But for God, it's not that big a deal because God is the Alpha and the Omega. He knows everything that will happen. He knows everything that could happen. He is the one who's actually in control and in charge of human history. And so Daniel, the prophet Daniel, this young man, gets to look forward and see what is going to happen in the future just as clearly as we look back on history. I mean, what an incredible opportunity for Daniel. Now, remember that God is showing Daniel what is going to happen in the area that will directly affect the Jews. And he's reminding Daniel that God is the one who is in control. And this is important for Daniel because things have been bad in the past. Things are going to get worse in the future. And it's important for God's people to know that this God whom they are to serve is actually in control of human history. And so what I want to do next on Digging Deeper is I want to take a look at Daniel chapter 8. And I want to look at it in two pieces. And I want us to see at how God is going to lay out what's going to happen in the future and how that is going to affect the children of Israel actually many, many centuries later. That's next on Digging Deeper. So as we begin to look at Daniel chapter 8, I want to look at it in two pieces. And so the first thing I want us to see is I want us to see Daniel's dream. And we find this in Daniel chapter 8, verses 1 through 14, where it says, "In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me," Daniel, "and after that, which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa in the capital, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai canal. So I raised my eyes, and I saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. And it had two horns, and both horns were high, but one of them was higher than the other. And the higher one came up last. And so I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. And he did as he pleased, and he became great. Now, as I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth, without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram with the two horns which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal. And he ran at him in his powerful wrath. And I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram and broke the two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he was cast down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. And then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of the heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great, toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. And it became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. And then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is a vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary to the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings. And then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. So what I want to do is I want to take a look at this vision. I want to break it down and I want to talk about it. So first of all, we see in the first two verses here of chapter 8 that Daniel's setting the stage. So this vision recorded by Daniel came to him 2 years after the vision of chapter 7. Now in this vision, Daniel saw himself in the palace in Susa, one of the Persian royal cities, more than 200 miles east of Babylon on the Ulai Canal. Now, 100 years later, the Persian king Xerxes built a magnificent palace there, which was where the events recorded in the book of Esther took place. So in this dream, we see a ram. This is in verses 3 and 4. Now, this ram had 2 horns. And Daniel tells us that one horn was longer than the other. And the goat went to the west, the north, and then south, and nothing could stop it. So let's take a look at the dream here. We'll take a look at the interpretation in just a second. But that's the first thing he saw. He saw a ram with 2 horns. One horn's larger than the other. Nothing could stop it. It went west and north and then south. Now, the second beast that he saw was a goat, and that's what we see in verses 5 through 14. Now, we know a number of things about this goat. First of all, it had one prominent horn. That this goat came from the west, and its feet did not touch the ground. It defeated the ram, and it could not be stopped. And then, in the process of not being stopped, the big horn fell off. And then 4 horns rose in place of the one horn. Now, one of the 4 horns raises to power to the south, east, and over Palestine, or over Israel, the beautiful land. And it sets itself up as the prince of the host. So he's the prince of all princes. And the 10th thing that we see is that he stops the daily sacrifices, and that he will be brought down after 2,300 evenings and mornings. And the sanctuary will then be reconsecrated. So that's the dream. That's what Daniel saw. So now let's take a look at the interpretation of the dream, because this, I believe, is absolutely fascinating. Remember, he is telling us this 700 years before Christ. He's 500 years before Christ. So we're talking. This is an amazing dream of what he's in Babylon right now. Babylon was the head of gold, and we know, of course, in just a few short years that Babylon's going to fall, but nobody knows that yet. And so the interpretation we find in verses 15 through 27. It says, "And when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, 'Gabriel, make this man understand the vision.' And so he came near where I stood. And when he came, I was frightened, and he fell on my face. But he said to me, 'Understand, O man, that the vision is for the time of the end.' And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand up. And he said, 'Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation. For it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. Now, as for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others rose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter And one of their kingdoms, at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and he shall succeed in what he does. And he will destroy mighty men, and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true. But seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. And then I rose and went about the king's business. But I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. So, in this interpretation, we find that Gabriel tells Daniel that this vision is about the future. That Daniel's going to be long gone before it is fulfilled. Now, the time of the end is from the defeat of Jerusalem in 587 BC to the Lord's return to set up his kingdom. So he's talking about what's going to happen before the Lord sets up his kingdom. And so first of all, he starts off with the ram. And he tells Daniel what's going on with the ram in verse 20. So this ram has two horns. And so the country, there will be two countries who will become one, Media and Persia. And so that's why this ram has two horns. It's two countries becoming one, two people groups becoming one. Now, the one horn was longer than the other. Now, we know that the Persians outshone the Medes. Hence, one horn is bigger than the other. Now, remember, God's giving some incredible description here because he wants Daniel to know, and he wants those who read it later on to understand specifically and exactly what he's talking about, because it's going to matter. Now, so the Persians outshone the Medes, and the goat went to the west, and then to the north, and then to the south. And we know that Persia extended its empire to the west, to the north, and then to the south, with a vast army of more than 2 million soldiers. And nothing could stop it. They conquered everyone in its path. And so this first vision, now remember, Daniel is still in Babylon. Now Persia, the Medes and the Persians are causing problems. They're beginning to stir elsewhere in the world. They're starting to, they're beginning their conquest of the unknown world. But it hasn't happened yet. Babylon is still the big kid on the block. And so when Gabriel tells Daniel about what's happening here, he's looking into the future. And he wants them to know that the Medes and the Persians are going to take over. So I think that's why when Babylon finally fell, Daniel really wasn't, he was kind of nonplussed. He didn't really bother him at all because he actually knew that it was going to happen. He may not have known it was going to happen at this time, in his lifetime, but it wasn't an issue when it happened. And he just knew that, hey, God said it was going to happen. And of course it did. So Persia is going to go out and it's going to conquer the world. And this is going to last for a while. And Persia did last. Persia lasts for a couple of 100 years. Until the goat rises up. And he begins to talk about the goat in verse 21. And he says a number of things about this goat. The first thing that he says is that there's going to be one prominent horn. Now, this goat is the Grecian Empire, which is, of course, we know the third empire in Daniel's two dreams was the first one in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and then his own dream in chapter 7, that this progression of kingdoms, Babylon, Persia, Greece, ultimately Rome. So now we're only dealing with Persia and Greece because this is the one that's going to matter to us. So one prominent horn, of course, that horn was Alexander the Great. Alexander was able to do what nobody else could do by the sheer force of his character and the charismatic nature of who he was. He was able to galvanize the Greeks to go on an offensive war against the Persians. That had never happened that I know of in Grecian history. They would come together to fight against a common enemy, but I can't find anywhere where the Greeks actually went out as conquerors. They were very, very content, very happy to just be left alone and hang out in the Greek Isles, enjoy the sun, and build a whole bunch of condos. But Alexander the Great changed that. Now, he came from the west. In other words, he started from the west. Now, the west was compared to Babylon or to Persia. And Greece was to the west of those places, and that's where he began. It says his feet did not touch the ground. And so we know that Alexander had a small but a very fast army. And so his conquering was just like that. It was so fast that it put blitzkrieg, made it look like it was in slow motion. Alexander just kept going. He went quickly, that he defeated the ram. And we know that Alexander was enraged at the Persians for having defeated the Greeks at the Battle of Marathon in 490 and at the Battle of Salamis in 481. Now, these were Greek cities near Athens. And so Alexander he learned this hatred from his father, Philip of Macedon. And so he went out to defeat the Persians, and he quickly conquered. Not only did he conquer the Persians, but he also conquered Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia in just a few years. And he began all this in 334. Now, Alexander could not be stopped. The Persians were helpless against him, and they were finally defeated at the Battle of Granicus in 334, and then finally the Battle of Issus in 333 BC. So everything so far that Daniel is seeing in this vision is taking place. Now, the big horn, we know, fell off, he said, and Alexander died at the height of his power. He died of malaria and complications from alcoholism in 323 at the age of 32, and he died in Babylon. So he was cut off. Now, again, this is absolutely insane to me that Daniel is talking about something at the end of the Babylonian rule, at the end of, we're talking 500 BC here, give or take a day or two. Now we're talking about something that's going to take place and happen in 323. It's absolutely insane what he is able to do. So this one horn was cut off. He died. And then from that, 4 horns rose in its place. Now we know that Alexander had no legitimate heirs. And so his kingdom was split up, and it was given to 4 of his generals. So Ptolemy was given Egypt and parts of Asia Minor. That would be modern-day Turkey. Now, Cassander was given the territory of Macedonia, which would be in Greece, which would be where Corinth would be in Corinth, Thessalonica, and so on, Macedonia, and he got Greece. Lysimachus was given Thrace and parts of Asia Minor, which would be western Bithynia, Phrygia, Mysia, and Lydia. And then Seleucus was given the remainder of Alexander's empire, which included Syria, Israel, and Mesopotamia. So this would be the Fertile Crescent area in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, for example. Now, one of the horns, Daniel says, raises to power and then goes up against the south, and he's going to control the south, which would be Ptolemy, and then over Palestine or over Israel. And so we know that years later, from among one of the 4 horns, or one of the kings, there would arise, Gabriel said that a severe and cunning king was going to come to a powerful ruler who would devastate property and destroy people in order to expand his kingdom. And the nation of Israel will be a special target of his oppression. Now, many people would lose their lives, and just when they thought they were safe, he would also come up against Israel's God. Yet this mighty conqueror himself would be destroyed by supernatural power. Now, his downfall was not of his own doing. We see this in verse 24. And his downfall was not by human means. In fact, we know that this king died insane in Persia in 163 BC. And so the next thing we see is that this king is going to set himself up as prince of the host, and he's going to stop the daily sacrifices. And then he will be brought down after 2,300 evenings and mornings. So the king referred to here is known as Antiochus IV, also known as Epiphanes. Now, he was quite a guy. After murdering his brother, who had inherited the throne in the Seleucid dynasty, Antiochus IV came to power in 175 BC. Now, in 170 BC, Ptolemy VI of Egypt sought to recover territory that was then ruled over by Antiochus. And so Antiochus invaded Egypt and defeated Ptolemy VI and proclaimed himself king in Egypt. We'll take a look at all this in great detail once we get to chapter 11. Now, this was so he defeated Ptolemy VI and he proclaimed himself king in Egypt. And this was his growth in power to the south, which we see recorded for us in verse 9. Now, on his return from this conquest, trouble broke out in Jerusalem, and so he decided to take over Jerusalem as well in verse 9. Now, the people were subjugated, and the temple treasury was plundered. And from this conquest, Antiochus returned to Egypt in 168, but was forced by Rome to evacuate Egypt. So on his return, he determined to make the land of Israel a buffer state between himself and Egypt. And so he attacked and he burned Jerusalem, killing many. And the Jews were forbidden to follow the Mosaic law in observing the Sabbath, their annual feasts, and the traditional sacrifices and the circumcision of children. We see this in verse 11. So altars to idols were set up in Jerusalem, and on December 16th, 167 BC, the Jews were ordered to offer unclean sacrifices and to eat swine's flesh or be penalized by death. Now, so Antiochus' desecration of the temple was to last for 2,300 evenings and mornings before its cleansing. He's referred to, so in this, he's referring to the evening and morning sacrifices at the temple. And these were interrupted by Antiochus' desecration. This is the time from Antiochus' desecration of the temple, December 16, 167 BC, to the refurbishing and restoring of the temple by Judas Maccabeus in late 164 and on into 163 BC, when all the Jewish sacrifices were fully restored and religious independence was gained for Judah. Now remember, Daniel's writing this when he's still in Babylon. Okay, so we're talking hundreds of years later. Everything that's happening is almost word for word what Daniel said was going to take place. This is absolutely, it's staggering. And then finally, the 12th thing that's going to happen is the sanctuary is going to be reconsecrated. So there is no question among scholars that Antiochus is the one in view in this prophecy. What was prophesied was fulfilled literally through him. However, the prophecy looks beyond Antiochus to a future person, the Antichrist, of whom Antiochus is only a foreshadowing. The coming one is said to stand against the Prince of Princes in verse 25. And this can be no other than the Lord Jesus Christ. So thus the prophecy must go beyond Antiochus and look forward to the coming of the one whose ministry will parallel that of Antiochus. And so I want us to see what God is doing here, because this is really amazing to me, is that God has gone to great lengths to get his word out. He's talked about it in Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 8, and we'll talk about it again in chapter 9. I'll talk about it in chapter 11. And God is going to lay out for anybody who is willing to listen who the Antichrist is, how this is going to set up the events that take place at the end of the age. The end before Messiah comes down, which is recorded for us in Revelation chapter 19, to set up his kingdom, and that as we continue in the beginning stages of the day of the Lord, which begins with the rapture of the church, which begins the period of the 7-year tribulation, which we'll talk about later, and it's going to continue all the way through the millennial kingdom, when God is finally going to set everything right, and we'll have a new heaven and a new earth. So, but in there, now we don't know when the rapture is going to take place. That is something that nobody knows, not even the Son. However, the events that lead up to the second coming, and when Jesus comes to set up his kingdom, There we have a lot of information, and Daniel's given us a lion's share of the Old Testament understanding. He's tying these things together. And the one thing he's doing here is he's tying out who the Antichrist is, because he doesn't want there to be any misunderstanding for anybody who's living at the time when the Antichrist comes to power. So he's telling us where he comes from. He's telling us what he's like, what he's going to do, how he's going to go about doing that, so that when somebody comes up from this place where you find a confluence of the Seleucid Empire plus the Roman Empire, and that you see somebody coming up into power who's going to fulfill all the things that Daniel has to say. He wants people to be aware that this is the Antichrist. Do not follow him. Do not bow down before him. And so Daniel is being very, very specific so that those who are living in the tribulation period would be able to understand what's happening. But I think he's also doing something more just as special for us, is that if God is able to tell the story before it happens. We're talking human history before it happens, with all the myriads of free choices that people have. If God knows that so well, how much can we trust him in our day-to-day lives? And how much do we know that God is the one who is working out human history for his purposes? And it's our responsibility as the people of God to continue to tell other people about him, to expand the kingdom of God as best we can, because we know that God is orchestrating human events to bring us to the end when Jesus can come back. And so I think that the reason that God wants us to know what he's doing is so that God's people would know that he is the one in control no matter what happens. And if he knows what's going to happen, again, I think it's safe for us to know that he can be trusted. And this, I think, is so important for us because, again, how often do we hear the most important election of our time period? All these things, all these fear mongering that comes out. But folks, when it comes right down to it, we need to follow the advice of the scriptures. Some trust in horses, some trust in chariots, but I will place my trust in the name of the Lord our God. And I am so happy and I am so blessed knowing that we have a God and we serve a God. This is the God of the Bible, not the God that our society says is acceptable. This is the God of the Bible. This is the God who's the creator. This is the God who has a plan. This is the God who's going to work out that plan, and he's even going to use human beings to make that happen. And we can trust him because this God is the one who says, I love you. He sent his son to die for us. He gave us a whole series of promises that we know that he will fulfill the promises that he made. And he gives us some glimpses in the book of Daniel. And so I pray that you are encouraged by these words. I pray that just as you stop and think about the fact that God really is that amazing. Because in our world today, our society is trying to give us a counterfeit to God, one that is socially acceptable. And we hear about how the God of the Old Testament is that he's a capricious God, that he's bloodthirsty, all these things. And none of that's true. In fact, even in the time when he's pouring out his judgment, there's still grace throughout the whole time. He's still calling people back to him. And because we know that everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. And so again, I pray that you are encouraged. I pray that as you gather to worship this week and with your siblings in Christ, that you really stop and think about this incredible God that we serve, that you would respond to him with all that you are. And I look forward to seeing you again in a future video. God bless you all.